Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's episode, thanks to some persistent poking from Batsfine, I'll be taking a look at Lorelai, the third and final part of Harvester Games' The Devil Came Through Here trilogy. Join me as I navigate its unnerving narrative, piece together its puzzles, and ultimately try and figure out if this particular devil deserved its due. I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. All Lorelai wanted was a fresh start, a means of getting away from life at Rosebery Lane, away from those cigarette-stained walls, the empty bottles that served as window dressing, and the drunken leers of her stepfather. And yet, as much as she fantasizes about a way out, it's far from simple. What would happen to her younger sister, Bethany, in her absence? Or her mother, if she wasn't there to ask about the accidents that happened to her when her husband's been drinking? And so she remains trapped until the unthinkable happens, until the world she knows comes to an abrupt end, and she's introduced to a new one, where domestic terrors mingle with the otherworldly. Her only chance of surviving the night comes with the aid of the enigmatic figure known as the Queen of Maggots. And that's really all I can say on the matter without spoiling a lot, given just how many twists and turns are baked into the story. That said, this is definitely a title I found myself wanting to gush about on a narrative front, because it managed something that most horror games fail to do. It made me uncomfortable on a very personal, visceral level. As much as there are elements of supernatural horror to be found, what plays central to Lorelai is a very real and uncomfortable look at a broken, dysfunctional home. And it hardly stops there either, given that even when the story shifts gears, it still manages to provide a very real and intensely uncomfortable snapshot of people and their struggles in a few settings. That said, veterans of the trilogy may notice some acute differences in the way it chooses to tell its story. For one thing, I'd argue that Lorelai might be a bit more forgiving as far as this narrative progression goes, as whilst you can engage in some unpleasant and morally questionable behavior, the ramifications of those actions feel a bit more front-loaded. In fact, I'd say that the art of acquiring Lorelai's golden ending is a lot less complex than its predecessors, hinging more on a particular choice you make near the climax. And it takes some degree of effort on your part to unlock the darkest permutations of its outcomes. What's more, the story plays out in a somewhat denser, more cinematic manner than earlier entries in the series, which does contribute to a notable difference in pacing. In fact, I'd argue that the gameplay actually takes a step back this time around. That's not to say there aren't puzzles to navigate, but they're definitely a lot more spaced out, with a larger focus put on simply guiding Lorelai through her journey and experiencing it. To this end, the puzzles that you encounter tend to be on the simpler side of things, specifically the adventure gaming staple of finding specific objects and figuring out how to properly use them with other objects in the environment. That's not to say there aren't some satisfying ones to solve, but that was more from the distinct aha that came from embracing the weird nightmarish logic the game runs on. Or basic logic, in the case of me successfully making microwave curry without completely fucking it up.
Shit.
The answer is not to do what I just did there. Anyways, overall, what I'm trying to say is you shouldn't expect to find yourself stumped at any one section, even when the game introduces something novel, like a chase sequence or a stealth segment. It's not a prohibitively difficult endeavor, especially given the game's generosity with save slots and autosaves. At the end of the day, it wants you to be able to progress forward, though there's nothing stopping you from fussing about and getting into some shenanigans.
Enjoy your cuppa, bitch.
That all said though, I suppose I ought to move on to the aesthetics, and I actually have a lot to talk about here. Like I said in the story, there's a certain cinematic bent to this title, and I mean that quite literally, given that it uses cleverly choreographed montages, the nightmarish juxtaposition of images, and even dreamlike distortions of the visuals, all to further accentuate the story and the experience, the mood from scene to scene. It's a very slick experience. The careful attention to coordinating it with the game's soundtrack does mean that the dialogue is, well, it's unskippable. This can slow down a second playthrough if you're of the mind to poke in to experience different choices, but the voice acting is seriously stellar. There's more than a few exchanges that left me feeling a little more raw, even when I knew they were coming. Between that and experiencing certain soundtrack-laden moments all over again, it actually might be a worthwhile trade-off. But what does that all mean at the end of the day? Well, on my end, I'm actually having a bit of fun with my second playthrough, if only because I'm being a bit less altruistic in my decisions this time around. Something which has led to some notably interesting exchanges I never got to see the first playthrough, especially during the latter parts of the chapters. For instance, I got to enjoy the profound realization of why exactly I found a certain severed head with a key in its eye. So, when I boiled down my experience with Lorelai, I'd have to say that I do recommend this title. Whilst it might not be a mechanically dense endeavor, it's carried by the strength of its storytelling and offers both a surprisingly incisive stab at the psychological horror genre and some genuinely sincere moments laden throughout that it was just hard to go through. It's just really hard to go through. And even when it's not directly aiming for discomfort, it still handles the themes central to its story with a sense of gravity they'd require, which I can't say this enough, but the 5th chapter is just hard, especially when you stop being altruistic. My stomach sank during that entire fucking segment. Admittedly, if you are the sort of player that's more gameplay oriented, this title might feel a bit slower due to the inability to skip ahead, something made even more noticeable when you poke through the game a second time, and yet I'm still having a good time overall. What's more, for those keeping count of the trilogy as a whole, I think it serves as a fitting epilogue to the journey, while still being able to function as a standalone title. I'd honestly recommend this game as a very strong example of a hit, to the point that I'm half tempted to poke back into its predecessors, though I feel I'll leave that one up to you folks. If you want to see me go and tackle Downfall or the Cat Lady, feel free to leave a message in the comments and we can see about exploring that one. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other member of Crit Hit, which is Hop, my precious, precious editor buddy. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That's it, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.